When you sign your name in blood with the Mafia, retirement usually comes with the slam of a gavel or the bang of a gun. If it's the latter, one can only hope for a quick and concise conclusion. Today we're covering 5 of the most brutal gangsters gunned down in the line of work, starting with Anthony Little Augie Carfano, a man who had once held the keys to a vast gambling empire, but by 1959 was nothing more than a bad bet, waiting to be cleared from the ledger. He was a gangster of the old guard, a protege of Frankie Yale, a confidant of Lucky Luciano, and a staunch ally of Frank Costello. But the tide had turned. Costello had been dethroned. Vito Genovese ruled now, and Carfano, stubborn and unrepentant, had made the fatal mistake of refusing to kneel. Born into the streets of Lower Manhattan in 1895, Carfano grew up in the ruthless crucible of New York's underworld. A prizefighter in his youth, he had fists that could break bone and a temper to match. But it wasn't his hands that earned him power. It was his cunning. By the 1920s, he had climbed the ranks of Frankie Yale's Brooklyn Empire, a trusted lieutenant in bootlegging, gambling and extortion. When Yale was gunned down in a hail of bullets in 1928, his car riddled with machine gun fire on orders from Al Capone, Carfano survived the bloody transition of power. He allied himself with Joe Masseria, the so-called boss of bosses, and after Masseria's own assassination in 1931, he seamlessly fell into line with Charles Lucky Luciano and his newly reorganized crime family. For decades, Carfano was untouchable. He built a lucrative gambling empire stretching from New York to South Florida, operating high-end casinos, underground betting parlors, and even legitimate resorts. He was the bridge between the New York underworld and the sun-soaked corruption of Miami, a city where gangsters and politicians played the same game with different stakes. But in the Mafia, no throne is permanent. By the late 1950s, a new order had taken hold. Vito Genovese, a man who ruled with paranoia and an iron fist, had seized control of the Luciano crime family. Carfano's mentor, Frank Costello, had been forced into retirement after a botched assassination attempt. The world was shifting, and Little Augie was on the wrong side of history. Carfano should have seen it coming. He had spent the evening at Marino's, an upscale Manhattan restaurant where the powerful wined and dined away their sins. Among the familiar faces in the crowd was Janice Drake, a former Miss New Jersey, now an aging beauty queen with a penchant for bad men. She had been linked to gangsters before, called in as a witness in the assassinations of both Nathan Nelson and Albert Anastasia. But tonight she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Midway through dinner, Carfano received a phone call. He listened in silence, his jaw tightening. When he hung up, he turned to his dinner companions and forced a smile. "Business," he said. "Urgent." He and Drake left Marino's together, slipping into Carfano's black Cadillac. The city lights flickered against the polished chrome as they drove off into the night. What Carfano didn't know, what he should have suspected, was that death was already waiting for him inside that car. The killers were in the back seat, their guns drawn, their orders clear. Carfano never even had the chance to fight back. The Cadillac slowed near an isolated stretch of road near LaGuardia Airport. The muzzle flashes were quick, the silenced gunfire barely a whisper in the dark. A single shot to the back of the skull, execution style, ended Carfano's reign. Drake, unlucky enough to be a witness, was granted the same fate. Their bodies were left slumped in the front seats, the car idling like a hearse waiting for its next occupant. By the time a patrol officer stumbled upon the scene, the assassins were long gone, and all that remained of Anthony Carfano was a cooling corpse and a shattered legacy. The underworld doesn't mourn its dead, it dissects them. Theories swirled about why Carfano was marked for death. The official story pointed to Vito Genovese, whose ruthlessness left no room for old loyalty. Carfano had refused to acknowledge his rule, and in the Mafia, defiance is a crime punishable by execution. But there was another, darker theory, one that traced the murder back to Meyer Lansky and the Cuban casino empire. Carfano had been making moves, eyeing Havana as the next jewel in his gambling empire, but Havana belonged to Lansky and, by extension, to Genovese. If Carfano had been plotting to expand without permission, it would have been more than enough reason to have him erased. The aftermath told its own story. With Carfano gone, his South Florida operations fell neatly into Lansky's hands. The old gangster had been replaced before his body was even cold. In the end, Anthony Little Augie Carfano died as he lived, believing himself untouchable. But you know, the Mafia does not forget, it does not forgive. And when the time comes to settle accounts, it does so with the same cold efficiency that Carfano himself had once employed. As the years passed, the murder faded into the long, blood-stained history of New York's underworld. No arrests were made, no confessions were given, and the men who pulled the trigger went on living just another set of faceless killers in a business where death is currency. In the Mafia, death isn't just expected, it's inevitable. Daniel J. Ayamasya, a hardened Bronx enforcer, spent years cracking skulls, dodging convictions, and carving his name into the underworld beside crime lords like Dutch Schultz. He had survived gangland executions, courtroom betrayals, and enough bullets to fill a graveyard. But one June evening in 1931, his luck ran dry. A sudden burst of gunfire turned the streets into his execution chamber. His abdomen ripped apart, his arm shattered, his life draining out onto the pavement. And yet, even in death, the spectacle continued. But power is fleeting, and for all the wealth and blood spilled in his name, Daniel J. Ayamasya ended up in the ground like any other man. Let's unravel the savage story of this ill-fated enforcer. Daniel J. Ayamasya was born in 1902 into a world already steeped in hardship and ambition. The son of Italian immigrants, Giuseppe and Rosina Ayamasya, his childhood on the unforgiving streets of New York City molded him into a man both ruthless and shrewd. His parents, weary from their transatlantic journey from Campobasso, Italy, had sought the promise of prosperity, only to find themselves trapped in the city's labyrinth of poverty and crime. Their son, Daniel, was not one to wait for fortune to smile upon him. He would take what he desired, no matter the cost. Ayamasya's criminal record was a testament to his unchecked audacity. By the time he was barely a man, he had already danced with the law on numerous occasions, each time slipping free like a spectre in the night. A charge of assault and battery in 1918 was quietly buried when the victim vanished into the ether. The following year, he was apprehended for rape in the Bronx, an offence that, like so many others, dissolved into the murky depths of corruption. Burglary, robbery, unlawful entry, his litany of transgressions painted a portrait of a man for whom rules were mere inconveniences. Despite his brushes with the law, Ayamasya was not merely a common thug. He was a man of power, feared and respected in equal measure, his name whispered in the dimly lit back rooms of New York's underworld. He became an enforcer for the notorious Bronx organizations helmed by Kiro the Artichoke King, Terranova, and the infamous Arthur Dutch Schultz Flegenheimer. In their service he honed his craft in violence, his loyalty etched in blood and silence. The true depths of his connections came to light on the fateful night of December 7th, 1929. A lavish banquet at the Roman Gardens, meant to honor Magistrate Albert Vitale, descended into chaos when 7 masked gunmen stormed the event. The crime scene was a tableau of upturned tables, shattered glass, and frantic screams. And yet, what should have been a daring heist ended in an almost theatrical twist. Every stolen item, including a police detective's revolver, was mysteriously returned after Vitale made a single phone call. The message was clear. The law and the criminals were two sides of the same tarnished coin. The ensuing scandal rippled through the city, toppling careers, forcing resignations, and exposing the grotesque symbiosis between organized crime and the justice system. Ayamasya's life continued on its inevitable trajectory, marked by bloodshed and betrayal. When Joseph the Baker Catania was executed in the Bronx on February 3, 1931, Ayamasya and his associate Daniel De Stefano found themselves ensnared in the ensuing investigation. The Castellamarese War had transformed New York into a battleground, and Ayamasya was no stranger to the shifting tides of power. As the streets ran red with the blood of fallen men, Ayamasya stood steadfast, a loyal sentinel at Dutch Schultz's side. That loyalty, however, would be his undoing. On the evening of June 18, 1931, Ayamasya and Schultz emerged from a Fifth Avenue apartment, their senses honed for the scent of danger. In the dim glow of the street lamps, they spotted 2 figures lurking in the shadows. In the lawless theater of their lives, hesitation meant death. With pistols drawn, they fired into the darkness, convinced they were striking first in an ambush by Vincent Mad Dog Cole's gunmen. But fate, ever the cruel puppeteer, had other plans. The men in the shadows were not rival assassins, but law enforcement officers. Gunfire erupted, and in the chaos, Ayamasha fell. A crimson bloom spread across his abdomen, his lifeblood seeping into the pavement of 1212 Fifth Avenue. His right arm, shattered by another round, lay useless at his side. The once unstoppable enforcer of the Bronx was reduced to a crumpled heap of flesh and regret. He was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital, but the battle was already lost. His life ebbed away in the sterile glow of the operating room. In death, Ayamasha was elevated to near-mythic status. His funeral was a grotesque spectacle, a procession befitting a fallen king. 125 cars of mourners trailed behind his silver coffin, their grief tinged with the acrid scent of opportunism. Dutch Schultz, ever the showman, paid homage with a towering wreath of lilies. Kiro Terranova outdid him with a floral gate of roses, carnations, and yet more lilies stretching 15 feet into the sky, a fitting monument to the ephemeral nature of power. For all the grandeur of his send-off, Ayamasha's final resting place was devoid of extravagance. His body was first held in the private mausoleum of Undertaker Daniel Scocozzo, awaiting the completion of a rumoured $25,000 crypt. But in the end, his remains found solace in a modest grave at St. Raymond's Cemetery. A stark contrast to the opulence of his funeral, a fitting end for a man who had lived in the shadows, wielding power like a blade. His story, like so many before him, was swallowed by the ever-churning tides of history. A life built on violence, deception, and unwavering loyalty had earned him both infamy and oblivion. The streets of New York, once stained with his sins, moved on, indifferent to the ghosts left in their wake.
Power in the Mafia is a ticking time bomb. Hold on too long and it will blow you to pieces. Salvatore Toto. Tequila clawed his way to the top, not just as a boss, but the boss of bosses, ruling with paranoia, precision, and a ruthless hand. His enemies didn't just fear him, they were erased by him, but no king rules forever. When the underworld turned against him, Tequila found himself in the crosshairs of a bullet-riddled coup. His execution on a Manhattan street was as cold-blooded as the reign he once commanded. This is the story of a man who built an empire from blood and lost it in a storm of gunfire. Salvatore Toto D'Aquila was born into the rugged streets of Palermo, Sicily, in 1873, destined to carve his name into the blood-stained history of the American Mafia. His story is one of unchecked ambition, betrayal, and the cold inevitability of underworld justice. By the time his bullet-riddled body collapsed onto the pavement of Avenue A in Manhattan in 1928, the man who had once ruled as Capo de Capi had become little more than a footnote in the deadly evolution of organized crime. D'Aquila arrived in America in 1906, a time when the Mafia's grip on New York City was still taking shape. With an enterprising mind and an insatiable hunger for power, he ingratiated himself within the Morello crime family, the city's first true Mafia dynasty. The family was led by the notorious Giuseppe the Clutch Hand Morello, a man whose deformed claw-like fingers were as infamous as his penchant for eliminating rivals. D'Aquila, a calculating opportunist, quickly became one of Morello's trusted lieutenants, operating in the Bronx while maintaining a facade of legitimacy through his cheese-importing business. But power in the Mafia is a shifting tide, and when Morello and his brutal enforcer, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, were arrested for counterfeiting in 1910, D'Aquila saw his opening. With Morello behind bars, he declared himself the new boss of bosses, establishing his own crime family and laying the foundation for what would eventually become the Gambino family. His reign, however, was defined by paranoia and relentless purges. D'Aquila was not content with ruling his own empire, he sought absolute control over the entire Mafia landscape. He embedded spies within rival families, issuing quiet death warrants against any who opposed him. He orchestrated the execution of the Lamonte brothers in East Harlem, believing them to be a threat to his authority. But his most infamous act of treachery came in 1920, when Morello was released from prison. Fearing retribution, D'Aquila ordered the murder of his former mentor and 10 of his closest allies. To carry out this bloodletting, he turned to his trusted enforcer, Umberto Valenti, a remorseless killer known for his skill with a gun and an utter lack of conscience. Yet fate has a cruel sense of irony. Valenti, tasked with eliminating upstart Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, Morello's heir to power, failed spectacularly. Masseria, with the cunning of a cornered animal, turned the tables and had Valenti executed in broad daylight in 1922. This blunder cost D'Aquila dearly. His iron grip on New York's underworld began to loosen as Masseria rose from the shadows to challenge his rule. Even some of D'Aquila's most trusted allies, including his longtime confidant Saverio San Polaccia, abandoned him in favor of Masseria's growing empire. As the years dragged on, Daquila found himself increasingly isolated, his once formidable power crumbling under Masseria's relentless onslaught. In a desperate bid to reclaim dominance, he retreated to his Bronx stronghold near the gates of the Bronx Zoo, clinging to what little power remained. But in the world of the Mafia, weakness is a death sentence. On October 10, 1928, as he stepped out of a doctor's office in Manhattan, Daquila's reign came to an abrupt and violent end. The execution was swift and merciless. His killers ambushed him, firing multiple rounds into his body before disappearing into the chaos of the city. The message was clear: his time was over, and Masseria now reigned supreme. In the aftermath, what remained of Daquila's fractured empire was swiftly absorbed into the growing ranks of the Castellamarese faction, soon to be embroiled in the bloody war that would reshape the Mafia forever. The remnants of his once mighty organization eventually fell into the hands of Frank Scalise and Vincent Mangano, setting the stage for the rise of the Gambino crime family. Toto Daquila had built his kingdom on a foundation of betrayal, fear, and ruthlessness. But in the Mafia, kings do not die peacefully in their beds. They die in the streets, their lifeblood soaking the pavement, their names whispered only in the dark corners of history where ghosts of the past still linger.
New York City, in 1931, was a city balanced on the blade of a knife. The air in the boroughs was thick with tension, the kind that only comes when men know their time is running out. The Castellamarese War had bled the underworld dry, leaving bodies in gutters and names scrawled in the ledgers of the dead. The old ways were crumbling. A new order was rising, one that had no room for those too stubborn or too foolish to see which way the wind was blowing. Vincenzo Jimmy Marino Lepore was one of the men who refused to kneel, and for that he paid in blood. Born in 1899 in the rugged hills of Abruzzo, Italy, Lepore was a child of immigrants, part of the great tide of Italians who crossed the Atlantic chasing opportunity but often finding something much darker. He arrived in New York in 1905, his family settling into the tenements of Manhattan before moving to the Bronx, a borough where men like him, hard, hungry and ambitious, could carve out a life if they were willing to take it by force. By 1930, the country was drowning in the misery of the Great Depression, but men like Lepore had found a way to turn desperation into profit. He had built his name in bootlegging, specializing in the illicit production of whiskey, using a scheme that soaked wood shavings from old liquor barrels to create a drink that passed as the real thing. The authorities suspected him of running a major operation in the Bronx, calling him the boss of the grape racket at the New York Central Railroad's Webster Avenue yards. He sold grape concentrate disguised as harmless wine bricks to those who knew how to ferment them into something much stronger. It was a lucrative business, one protected by bullets and bribes. Lepore wasn't just a bootlegger, he was a muscle man, a soldier for Salvatore Maranzano, the last great warlord of the old Sicilian Mafia in America. He had spilled blood for Maranzano, stood by him in the Castellamarese War, and when Maranzano declared himself the undisputed boss of bosses after the assassination of Joe Masseria in April 1931, Lepore believed he was standing on the winning side. He was wrong. Maranzano had made a critical mistake. He underestimated the ambition of Charles Lucky Luciano, a man with no patience for the old world's codes and feuds. Maranzano wanted to rule with an iron fist, demanding absolute loyalty. Luciano had no interest in kings. He wanted an empire, and he was willing to wipe out anyone who stood in his way. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano's time ran out. The assassins came as government agents, well-dressed, polite, and deadly. They stepped into his office on the 9th floor of 230 Park Avenue, and within minutes, the so-called boss of bosses was gasping his last breaths, his body riddled with bullets and punctured by the blade of a knife. The moment Maranzano hit the floor, his empire collapsed with him, and anyone loyal to the dead man became a walking corpse. That same evening, the killing squads fanned out across the city, striking at Maranzano's men before they had time to react. New Jersey, Pittsburgh, the Bronx, the underworld still speaks of it as the night of Sicilian Vespers, a purge so ruthless that the truth became buried beneath myth. For Vincenzo Lepore, it wasn't myth, it was death, swift and certain. It was an unseasonably hot night in the Bronx. Lepore had spent the evening doing something ordinary, fatherly. He had picked up his two daughters, ages 4 and 6, from his mother-in-law's house at 540 East 187th Street and taken them to an Arthur Avenue barbershop to get their hair cut. Maybe he thought the storm had passed. Maybe he believed Maranzano's death had nothing to do with him. Or maybe he knew he was living on borrowed time. He stood in the doorway of the shop, rolling up his sleeves, complaining about the heat. It was the last thing he ever said. The first bullet tore into his skull, snapping his head back. Then came 5 more, ripping through his chest. He crumpled to the ground, dead before he even registered what had happened. The shooters were ghosts, their faces lost in the blur of streetlights and gunsmoke. Some witnesses claimed the shots came from a moving car. Others swore a man had stepped out of an automobile, walked up to Lepore, and fired point blank before slipping back into the vehicle, vanishing into the Bronx night. It didn't matter. The result was the same. The blood pooled on the sidewalk, mixing with the dust and the grime as the barbershop's neon glow flickered overhead. Inside, his daughters waited, unaware that their father had just become a footnote in a war already moving on without him. The police came, but they had no suspects, no witnesses willing to talk, no hope of solving a murder that was already being erased by the underworld's silent code. When officers searched Lepore's home, they found a revolver, a rifle and a single-barreled shotgun, all loaded and ready. It was clear he had expected trouble. He just hadn't expected it to come so soon. His family buried him in St. Raymond's old cemetery. The soil barely settled over his coffin before they packed their things and moved out of their St. Peter's Avenue home. By 1935, they had relocated to a modest apartment on Bathgate Avenue, leaving behind the ghost of a man whose name would only be spoken in hushed voices, if at all. Lepore's murder became part of the legend of that night, a night when the old world was burned away and something new was born. The night of Sicilian Vespers would grow in infamy, exaggerated over time, the body count inflated, the details distorted. But beneath the myth, the truth remained. Vincenzo Lepore died because he was loyal to a dead man. And in the world of the Mafia, loyalty was only rewarded with a shallow grave. Few men in the history of organized crime embodied pure, unrelenting violence like Carmine Lillo Galante. With a perpetual cigar clenched between his teeth and the cold, dead eyes of a born killer, he was a man who thrived in the shadows of New York's criminal underworld. His rise to power was carved out in blood, leaving a trail of bodies from the streets of East Harlem to the Sicilian heroin trade. But in the end, even the most feared gangsters meet their reckoning. For Galante, that reckoning came in a Brooklyn restaurant, where his reign of terror ended with a shotgun blast to the face, his ever-present cigar still smouldering between his lifeless lips. Born into the squalor of Manhattan's East Harlem in 1910, Carmine Galante was destined for a life outside the law. By the age of 10, he had already found himself in reform school, a violent, rage-filled delinquent with no interest in anything but crime. By 15, he had dropped out of school entirely, assembling a juvenile gang that terrorized the Lower East Side. His arrests started early, and his reputation as a fearless, remorseless thug grew quickly. By the 1930s, Galante had carved out a niche as a ruthless enforcer, feared even among his fellow gangsters. Working for Vito Genovese, he allegedly carried out more than 80 contract killings, his dead-eyed stare striking terror into law enforcement and criminals alike. Former NYPD detective Ralph Salerno once said, "Of all the gangsters I've ever met, only 2 men had the eyes of a killer. One was Agnello Della Croce, the other was Carmine Galante." His reputation reached chilling heights in 1943, when he was suspected of gunning down anti-fascist journalist Carlo Tresca as a favor to Benito Mussolini's allies in the US. Though arrested, no charges ever stuck. Galante was a master of slipping through the cracks, his penchant for violence masked by an almost supernatural ability to evade the law. By the 1950s, Galante had become a key player in the Bonanno crime family. His ambition knew no limits, and neither did his savagery. Sent to Montreal to oversee the Bonanno's heroin operation, he transformed the city into a vital hub for the infamous French Connection, importing vast quantities of narcotics into the United States. His brutality kept the operation running smoothly. Dissidents and rivals vanished without a trace, their fates sealed in cement-filled barrels dumped in the St. Lawrence River. Galante's appetite for power was insatiable. By the late 1970s, he had grown tired of being a subordinate and seized control of the Bonanno family while official boss Philip Rusty Rastelli was behind bars. Declaring himself the supreme ruler of the family, he began eliminating anyone who dared oppose him, including key figures from rival families. His biggest mistake, however, was underestimating the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia. Galante's aggressive grab for control of the heroin trade was a move too bold, too reckless. The five families could not allow it. On July 12, 1979, Galante sat down for lunch at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. At the table were Leonard Coppola, a loyal Bonanno capo, and Giuseppe Turano, the restaurant's owner. Nearby, his Sicilian bodyguards, Baldassare Amato and Cesare Bonventre, stood watch. As the summer sun bore down on the outdoor patio, Galante enjoyed his meal, his trademark cigar clenched between his teeth, blissfully unaware that his final course was about to be served in a hail of gunfire. At precisely 2:45 p.m., three ski-masked gunmen stormed the patio, shotguns and handguns drawn. In a matter of seconds, the air was thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood. Galante, Coppola and Turano were executed on the spot. A shotgun blast obliterated Galante's face, sending him crashing backward, dead before he hit the ground. And yet, in a grotesque display of poetic justice, that infamous cigar remained wedged between his teeth, a final mocking image of a man who thought himself untouchable. Curiously, his Sicilian bodyguards, men sworn to protect him with their lives, stood idly by as the bullets flew, untouched and unfazed. It was clear they had been in on it. The execution had been sanctioned by the very people Galante thought he ruled over. His arrogance had sealed his fate, and the Mafia had made sure his demise was as brutal as his reign. Galante's death was met with little mourning. The Archdiocese of New York refused to grant him a funeral mass, and his burial at St. John's Cemetery in Queens was a quiet, unceremonious affair. His assassination sent a clear message. No man, no matter how violent, no matter how powerful, was above the Mafia's rules. But the bloodshed didn't end there. In the years that followed, those involved in Galante's murder faced their own reckoning. Cesare Bonventre, the bodyguard who betrayed him, was found dismembered in a warehouse in 1984. Others met similar fates, their silences ensured by the very machine that had orchestrated Galante's downfall. Carmine Galante was a monster among monsters, a man who ruled through sheer terror. But even the most fearsome predator eventually becomes prey. And when the Mafia decided his time was up, they made sure his ending was as unforgettable as his legend. A blood-soaked execution, a cigar in his mouth and a lesson written in lead. No one is bigger than La Cosa Nostra.